Hi everyone, welcome to Work With Your Cycle for Shine Festival. I'm Sinead Brophy. I am a menstrual cycle coach, nutrition coach, and also a personal trainer, and I'm the founder of Go With The Flow, a company whose mission is to educate and empower young women such as yourselves to better understand their menstrual health, their nutrition, and then also how to work with their bodies, not against it. So welcome. What we're going to be talking about today, so what's it going to be all about? There's a great quote by Dr. Stacey Sims, and she says that women are not small men. And what she means by that is that actually, we have different hormones and different cycles to guys. So once we hit puberty, guys' main sex hormone, it's testosterone. And we have a little bit of testosterone, but our two main hormones are estrogen and progesterone. And we have that throughout different cycles. So for guys, testosterone stays pretty steady for most of their life until they get to an older age. For us, that kind of ebbs and flows throughout our menstrual cycle. And again, a lot of our research in the health and fitness area, and then also in the kind of sports science world, is based on college age men between 18 to 23. That doesn't necessarily always carry out to us because again we have those different hormones, we have those different cycles. Now there's been a huge amount of work in the last few years to start investigating this more, looking at female athletes, how their hormones might impact things like performance or health. So it's really exciting to see those changes come about. So we'll hopefully start to learn more about it, but this is just an area that I'm very passionate about. And when I say cycle, a lot of us, when we think about that, we only think about our periods, those days that we're bleeding, but actually our menstrual cycle is much more than that. It's that rise and fall of the estrogen and progesterone and other hormones, kind of throughout 21 to 35 days. Now, when you start menstruating at the start, it can sometimes be a little bit longer, it can be a little bit more irregular, but generally speaking, that should regulate out to be 21 to 35 days. And what's also amazing about our menstrual cycle is that it's our fifth vital sign. So when we talk about our vital signs, we mean like our heart rate, our breathing rate, our blood pressure, and all these things tell us whether we're healthy and how kind of what's going on with our body. And we have this unique opportunity as women or as people who menstruate to learn more about it and have this kind of sign that will tell us whether we're healthy or not. So if we're having a regular cycle and then all of a sudden it starts getting longer or maybe starts getting more painful, that can be an indication that something else is going on with our health. And it's up to us then, and it kind of empowers us to dig into that a little bit more. So it's really kind of great tool that we have in our toolkit to understand our health and ourselves a little bit better. So what we'll be covering today are important topics that we'll be discussing. The first one's going to be kind of getting to know your cycles, your hormones, understanding how that all works so that we can kind of understand how to work with our cycles. We're going to cover how your body changes throughout puberty and what to kind of expect with that. We'll talk about period loss and other sort of menstrual disturbances that you might want to get to know about and start spotting those symptoms through cycle tracking. And then finally, how to fuel correctly for optimum health as well, which is a huge part of kind of looking after yourself in general. This is the approach that I take when I'm coaching my clients and when I'm working with people as well. And it's the analogy of big rocks before sand. So it's actually taken from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And they have another version called the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens, which I read as a teenager and I loved. But essentially this analogy is talking about time management. So the idea is you've got a mason jar or a glass jar, and you've got your big rocks, which are the important things to help you get to whatever your goal is. The next one are the pebbles, which are kind of important, but not as important. They're good to do. And the last one is the sand, which are like nice to have. Doesn't really help you get any further, but it's good to kind of add it into your day if you have the time. If you put the sand in first, there's going to be no space for the rocks and the pebbles. But if you actually put the big rocks in first, then you can pour the pebbles in around it and it kind of slots in around that space. And then finally, you can actually pour the sand in and it will fill in all those extra gaps that you've left once you finish prioritizing your big rocks. The exact same applies to your health, lifestyle, and nutrition. So what I tell people is to focus on these big rocks and imagine them being your base of your pyramid. So they are the things you always want to focus on first to help create a really steady and strong foundation. From a lifestyle point of view, they include things like making sure you're getting enough sleep, super important, managing stress, especially in around, say, exams or all those changes that might be going on in your life. Self-care, huge thing, often overlooked. There's this kind of dialogue of, go hard or go home, more is better, all that kind of stuff. But self-care and stress management is a huge part of what I call finding the flow zone, which is kind of that nice little wave of a little bit of stress sometimes, but able to kind of recover from that, especially from a training point of view. If you're playing a sport, you want to make sure that you're balancing those higher intensity sessions with the lower intensity sessions. daily movement. So again, that could be kind of formalized exercise in the form of a sport, or it could just be incidental exercise, going for a walk, having a bit of a dance around, anything like that. And then I'm a big advocate of basic cycle tracking. So all of us kind of having some understanding of what our cycle is and what our normal is. Nutrition, then making sure we're drinking enough water, really important as well. For the most part, getting a good variety of whole foods and macronutrients, which are protein, carbohydrates, and fats, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later on. Eating enough, huge one. There was, I think, back in like 2004, there was a study with DCU for girls and boys between the ages of 14 to 17, I think it was, and they found that 80% of girls had undergone some sort of form of restrictive dieting to manage their weight. So that's a huge number, and they included like skipping meals and also vomiting as well. So it's a really kind of big issue, and I know the kind of teenage years, it can be a difficult period to go through, but really making sure that you're eating enough and that you're framing food as a way to nourish your body and support your body is really, really important. And that kind of leads into that relationship with food. So yes, for the most part, we want to make sure that we're getting kind of nutritious foods, but that also has a little bit of flexibility to, enjoy food. Food is social. There's a comfort element to food as well, and it's enjoyment in the eating as well. So it's really important that we kind of get that overall healthy approach to our nutrition. And then again, if you are playing sports or if you're exercising in any sort of structured way, that you're focusing on using nutrition as a way to recover as well. For example, protein, carbohydrates, all of that sort of stuff. We take it up a next level. So once you're kind of covering the majority of those kind of big rocks, we start to look at the pebbles. So it's things like tracking your cycle, maybe in a bit more depth, prioritizing your cycle health if anything's coming up for you, syncing with your cycle. So, you can kind of manage your training, your lifestyle, some kind of creative projects, a little bit more in tune with how your energies and your rhythms are throughout your cycle. And then again, from a kind of training point of view and for nutrition, things like making sure you're getting a good mix of micronutrients, protein consumption, especially in and around training if you are training, and really trying to prioritize fueling that sport. And then at the advanced level, it's more advanced cycle tracking methods. It's making, maybe you're trying to fully sync how you are with your cycle, with study, work, creativity projects, anything like that. But for most of us, and for this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the big rocks. And that really is oftentimes enough to make sure that you're prioritizing your health and your well-being as well. So getting to know your cycle. When we go through puberty, essentially it's kind of typically between the ages of 8 and 9. And it's also when hormones start to rise and they start to kind of cause a number of changes in our body, which are called the secondary sex characteristics. This kind of continues until it accumulates in what's called your menarche, which is your first period. And typically it's between the ages of 12 to 14, but sometimes that can be a little bit earlier as well. And as I mentioned before, sometimes it can take a while for your cycle to regulate. It might be a little bit long, it might be a little bit irregular to start out. But again, typically between 6 months to 2 years, your cycle should regulate out to be whatever that is for you. Those changes that we go through throughout puberty, our breasts develop, our uterus develop, our hips widen, we get growth spurts as well. We start to develop more body hair, maybe a bit of acne as well. That's super common in our teenage years. And also it's kind of important to note that specifically if we've got friends who are guys, I know I went to a mixed school, so what happens, and I've also have a twin brother. So what happens is we hit puberty and all of a sudden guys get that spurt of testosterone. They start putting on more muscle mass, they tend to lean out, they start getting bigger, stronger, all that kind of stuff. Where for us, with our hormones, we tend to start putting on a little bit more body fat. It's not that we can't put on muscle mass, but comparatively speaking to guys with their higher levels of testosterone, it might be a little bit harder for us to put on that muscle mass as well. So what this can result on in coupled with those hips widening, because what that does is biomechanically, it changes our angle from our hips down to our knees. It can mean that we maybe feel a little bit more imbalanced, a little bit more kind of gangly. We're worried about our bodies changing. And really what I'd say for you during this period is like, give yourself a bit of grace. Like your body is meant to change. This is how we develop into a woman, and make sure that we're kind of getting our kind of hormones healthy and that we're supporting our overall health as well. So, especially if you are playing a sport and all of a sudden you kind of feel like you're kind of bumping into things, you're not as kind of fast, or maybe kind of things feel a little bit more wobbly on the pitch. And again, coupled with that body fat gain, it's perfectly normal and it's supposed to be happening. If you feel like you are struggling a little bit with that technique element, there's no harm in maybe relearning your running technique, doing some extra drills, learning how you kind of be working on your landing mechanics. Maybe if you're kind of doing any running sports or field-based sports, if you're a dancer or you're a swimmer, you can kind of focus on those drills to help you relearn, because your body has changed, the shape has changed, and your composition has changed, but it really is something that's natural and normal to happen. So when we think about our sex hormones, so estrogen and progesterone, we often think about, and we think about our menstrual cycle, we're just thinking about our uterus a lot of the time. So we think about, okay, our period, we're growing that kind of endometrial lining in our uterus, and that the hormones come from our ovaries, which are here. But actually, it all starts with the brain. And why it's important that we understand this is that it's regulated through the hypothalamus, and that's our control center. It regulates our hunger signals, our body temperature, all of these sort of things, and also our production of our sex hormones. But it's very closely linked with our stress hormones. So stress can have a huge impact on our overall health, of course, but also our reproductive health, because essentially our cycle is there to conceive, whether that's what we're planning to or not. So what happens is, when you're in a stressful situation, your body goes, you know what, not a great time for me to bring a child into the world. It just thinks about those days where it's kind of fight or flight, all of that kind of stuff, and it shuts everything down because it's not important. And that's also from psychological stress. So again, you could be in an exam state, you might be kind of fighting with your friends, could be general anxiety. COVID, the world has massively changed at the moment, and it's kind of seen across the board. There's been huge changes in a lot of people's menstrual cycles throughout this past year. It also includes physical stress. So if you're, again, playing a lot of sport, really kind of overtraining, not getting that good mix of the high intensity with the low intensities, these are all signals for our body to be in a stressed state. Cortisol rises, and then our cycles shut down. As well, underfueling, huge one. And again, what can happen sometimes for teenagers in particular, these changes start to happen. We start putting on more body weight, and all of a sudden people freak out and they start going on those restrictive diets. But this can have a huge knock-on effect to our menstrual cycles. And again, that whole idea of having really, really low body fat, unless you are an elite athlete that requires you to have that, or you're, being a physique bodybuilder, being at a super low body fat percentage isn't actually advantageous. And we need to have a little bit of body fat, and specifically in comparison to guys, that number is higher for women as well. So it's important that we kind of understand this, and also realize that not only is this going to have a negative impact on our reproductive hormones, but those reproductive hormones, as we'll discuss later, has huge impacts to our overall health, our bone health, our heart health, our mental health. So it's really, really important that we're prioritizing having a healthy cycle for our overall health as well. So this is what the menstrual cycle looks like. So you can kind of see at the top here, it's broken into two halves. So the follicular phase and the luteal phase. I say halves, really it's kind of two portions or two phases. What we can see here is what's going on in our ovaries. And we'll kind of discuss this a little bit more. And then this section at the bottom is more about those hormones and how they rise and fall. So the first phase of our cycle is called the follicular phase. It's also known as phase 1 and phase 2. You might have heard it referred to as that. And really, we start with day 1 of our cycle as the first day of full bleeding. So that kind of heavy blood, red blood, that sometimes people spot beforehand, but day 1 is counted as that first full day of bleeding. And again, typically that goes on for 3 to 7 days. Estrogen starts to rise then. So basically our brains produce this thing called follicle stimulating hormone, which is what's going to help develop that follicle in our ovary, which contains the egg. It starts to mature and grow, and that starts to produce estrogen. We get this good surge of estrogen in that first half of our cycle. Coupled with that, we get a little surge of what's called luteinizing hormone, and those two hormones combined allow us to ovulate. So that's when we release the egg from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Estrogen is the dominant hormone of this part of our cycle. Maisie Hill, who's the author of a book called Period Power, refers to this as the Beyonce hormone. I just absolutely love that because it's great. She kind of gives each hormone a different character, for want of a better word, and it's brilliant because we feel a little bit more social, we're a little bit more sassy, we kind of have lots of energy, and we want to kind of do things and kind of make kind of put those plans into action as well. So typically it's referred to as the feel-good hormone. It's also anabolic, which means it helps us build muscle. We also get a little spike of testosterone here as well, because we do have testosterone as well as the guys. And it's really important for focusing on recovery. So it supports our recovery, and it also is really important for bone formation. So it helps us build the bone. Now it's kind of referred to as the Goldilocks hormone as well, because it likes being a bit of a balance. So too little, if we're not producing enough, can result in cycle irregularities, your loss of your period, which then has a knock-on effect to osteoporosis, heart disease, mental health issues. But having too much, or too much in comparison to our progesterone in the second half of our cycle, can cause things like breast tenderness, heavy periods, PMS symptoms, and over a longer period of time could contribute towards kind of breast cancer and endometrial cancer as well. Again, if we're focusing on that bottom of the pyramid and our overall health, our hormones for the most part will be in a nice balance with each other. So it's not something necessary to worry about, but it's good just to be aware of. Then we move on to the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is called so because when we ovulate, the follicle or the sac that holds that egg actually becomes a gland, which is actually incredible when you think about it, that we just grow a gland from scratch, like typically once a month or within each cycle. And it's this gland, the corpus luteum, hence luteal phase, it's what produces progesterone. So we can't produce progesterone unless we ovulate. And that's why ovulating is so important. And we want to make sure that we're supporting that through our kind of our nutrition and also our lifestyle as well. Once we ovulate, estrogen drops off, so that's that orange hormone again, and then progesterone starts to rise, which is this pink hormone. Again, some people feel different at different stages of this cycle, and we'll kind of discuss that later as well. If the egg isn't fertilized and no implantation occurs, basically those hormones drop off, and this drop off of hormone is what triggers our period. So essentially, we start to produce another chemical called prostaglandins, and they make our uterus contract. So we've built up our uterine lining here, we've kind of supported it, and then it starts to shed. And it's important that we know this because what can also happen is it can impact other smooth muscle in our body, such as our digestive tract. So you might have GI distress, upset stomach, you might get diarrhea, and it's really common in and around this time of our cycle as well. So it is normal and can happen. But again, progesterone is the main hormone of this phase of our cycle. It's called the Kristen Stewart hormone. It's a little bit more low key, a little bit more antisocial, a bit more introspective, all that kind of stuff. So it really kind of slows us down. From a, I guess, sports performance point of view, it's catabolic, so it can contribute towards muscle breakdown. Recovery can be a little bit harder here. You might get more DOMS, which is that, muscle soreness the next day after training. So really understanding what's going on here with your hormones can make sure that you're getting those recovery strategies in place to help support that. As I mentioned, it can only happen if we're ovulating. And progesterone has lots of really good benefits as well. So where estrogen builds our bone, progesterone stops us breaking it down. So it supports keeping healthy bones. It's also really important for our mental health, our central nervous system, and it helps support sleep as well. So super important that we're producing both those hormones. And as well, if we have too little progesterone in relation to how much estrogen we're producing, we can have those high estrogen symptoms like the PMS and kind of heavy menstrual bleeding. So it's important that we kind of get that good balance between the two. And then we're going to move on to tracking. So we kind of understand how the hormones work, but how do we actually go about understanding what's happening for us in our cycle? So there's lots of benefits to tracking your cycle. The first one is that we could just get to know our bodies. The second one is get to plan for your period. So I know when I was younger, I didn't really know when it was coming, and it would just come, and then I wouldn't have anything, I wouldn't have any period products, and I'd have to go to the nurse and get some tampons or whatever she had, and then like sometimes I'd leak and you'd be tying your jumper around your trousers, and it's just, it would be something that happened to me, rather than if I now, when I track my cycle, I know when it's going to come, or I'm at least expecting it, so I can plan for it. I make sure I've got my period products there. I feel a bit more kind of, empowered and in control of what's going on with me and my body. And it kind of takes that anxiety away from it and removes that kind of, I guess, the stigma or the kind of negative connotations we might have with getting our period as well. It's also really important for helping us manage our energy and our self-care, which again, at that bottom of the pyramid, it's a really important part of managing our overall health and well-being as well. And then it empowers us to help our own health. So you will go to the doctor, and once you start menstruating, your doctor will ask you when was your last period. And that is something that they're always going to ask you. And I just didn't know. But we should know, because what it also helps us do is know whether our cycles are regular. If we know what our normal cycle looks like, if things start to change, then we're able to be like, what maybe is there something else going on in my life? Am I managing my stress properly? Or maybe it's a sign that something else might be going on with our health. And we can bring that to our doctor and be like, this is what's going on. I'm not happy with this. I want to figure out what's going on. So it's a really, really kind of important tool that we have to advocate for ourselves and our own healthcare as well. So as I mentioned, planning for your period, it's there's a couple of different period products that you can use. And again, I like using the word period products rather than sanitary products, because it's again changing that whole dialogue we have around our periods. It's not something that's unhygienic, it's totally normal and part of being a woman or someone who menstruates. So it's important that we kind of change that language around it. But you can use tampons, you can use pads, you can use menstrual cup as well. Period pants is a kind of new one that's come out, and I think is a really great initiative as well. So especially if you're playing sports and you're worried about leaking, especially if you have white shorts, which, you know, it's never great for the old periods, you can use period underwear to kind of help, I guess, manage or catch any sort of leaks if you do have any sort of leaks. So again, just gives you that little bit of comfort of mind as well if you kind of are having to wear any white shorts. But we'll go on to how to manage your energy, seeing as hopefully the hormones will be a little bit fresher in your head and the different phases. But this is an example of how your cycle may look and feel to you. Again, it's really important that you track your cycle because each of us are going to have individual responses to this. But generally speaking, this is a typical 28-day cycle with the 7 days for each phase, all that kind of stuff, and how you may feel throughout it. The first phase, typically people can feel a little bit slower, don't feel great the first few days, you might have some cramps, etc. But after day 3, typically you start to pick up, start to feel a bit better, estrogen starts rising. So you may just want to focus on managing your energy and maybe not over kind of committing yourself to different kind of social events for those first few days. But it's important to note that, you know, as long as you're not in extreme pain or having really heavy bleeding, which we'll talk about later, you can play and train throughout your periods. You can go to PE, you can compete, you can go to your training. If it's not a competition for your sport and you're just training, you might want to drop that intensity down a little bit, but by all means, you can still go. And regular exercise has shown to actually help improve hormone balance, but also PMS symptoms as well. So it's kind of good to get some form of movement in. It's anti-inflammatory, can help bring down those symptoms. That second phase then, when estrogen starts to get higher, typically we start to feel good, tend to be a little bit more social. It's great times to get things done if you haven't got any big projects or big kind of study projects going on. And then from a sports performance point of view, again, this is a time that it's muscle building. So good time to push it in your training, good time to go for personal bests. If you're into, say, CrossFit or kind of any sort of gym-based training, good time to start kind of working on building that muscle and strength, so heavy weight training and maybe some higher intensity interval training or Metcon style stuff. If you're playing a field-based sports, obviously, again, that change of our angle from our hips to our knees makes us more likely to have ACL injuries. So I think we're like 2 to 8 times more likely to have an ACL injury in comparison to men. So making sure that you're getting a good warm-up is key, especially in around this time, because some studies suggest, and again, there's new research coming out on this, but at the moment, what we have is some studies suggest that that higher level of estrogen can cause our ligaments and our tendons to become a little bit more lax. So we might be a little bit more prone to being unstable through our, or unstable through our knees. So again, making sure that you're prioritizing them, getting that good warm up is going to be essential in and around this phase, but really throughout all phases of our cycle. Phase 3 then, highly individual. Some people feel great, other people really feel that drop off in the estrogen and then the progesterone starting to rise. So it's important that you understand how you feel at this stage. Again, just when we ovulate, some people can actually get a little bit of kind of pain and actually feel that ovulation. It's called Mittelschmerz, and you can kind of get some other symptoms. So again, it's important that you track it. Other people feel nothing and don't notice it at all. But if you are someone who feels that drop off in hormone, it might be more important to focus on recovery, getting in that protein. It's a great time if you're an endurance athlete or you do any sort of kind of triathlete, so that sort of styles of training or sport. If you're a runner, great time to get some steady state cardio in. Our hormones support that style of training. If you're struggling, you might just want to focus on dropping that intensity down a little bit. Still can get huge benefits from your training sessions, but again, it's just about more managing it so you're not overtaxing your system and managing that stress. And then the last one is phase 4. So this is typically when we get PMS. It's our natural deload week if you're thinking about it from a training point of view. We tend to be a little bit more introspective and reflective. It's good for us to prioritize our sleep, making sure that we're prioritizing self-care and recovery, and also we're hungrier. So, you know, the whole kind of chat about, oh, I'm craving X, Y, and Z around this time of my cycle, that's often actually because we just need more calories. So we're actually just hungrier. So our resting metabolic rate goes up. So have that extra snack. Give your body what it's asking for. You know, you might be deficient in some sort of micronutrient at this stage that your body's asking you for the chocolate because it wants magnesium, for example. And from a training point of view, great to try and focus on yoga, walks, being outside, meditation, all that kind of deloading and that yin versus the yang style training. And then how do we actually track? So there's a couple of different ways that we can track. You can just track it in your calendar, which I'm going to show you an example of how to do that now. You can track it in an app. There's some great apps out there. I particularly love Fitter Woman as a way to kind of track a very kind of basic cycle tracking, but it also gives you some great recommendations like I just showed you above about how you may feel and how you might want to adjust your nutrition and training. And it's jam-packed full of loads of recipes as well, which is cool. You can just do it in a diary or a journal as well. From a very, very basic point of view, the first thing that I mentioned before is just tracking day one. When did you get the first day of your last period? So at least you can see what your the length of your cycle is and how regular it is. Next step then, start adding how many days you're bleeding, the amount you're bleeding, so how much period products you're using per day. Any PMS symptoms then that you might be getting in this later half of the cycle, your mood, your energy, if you train or play sport, how that feels. And then anything else, like, are you more social? Do you feel more creative? Do you want to spend more time with yourself just reading a book or kind of not really going out? So you can track all these things and see if there's patterns for you. Now, there are more advanced cycle tracking methods that you can use. For most of you, this is going to be enough. As you start to get older, you might want to also start confirming whether you're ovulating as well to kind of make sure that you are ovulating so that you're producing progesterone. It helps you dial in maybe where you are in your cycle to adjust your training if you want to go a little bit further with that as well. And it's tracking things like your cervical mucus in and around ovulation, that spike in luteinizing hormone. You can use like little pea sticks to kind of track that. And then if you take your temperature every morning, you'll see a rise in that body temperature when progesterone is higher because it increases our core temperature. But for the most part, just using this kind of more basic or more kind of focused style of tracking is perfectly adequate for most people. What I would encourage all of you to do is just start tracking today. So you can literally just start putting emojis into your calendar, and that is a great way to track it. Lots of the apps have emojis kind of built into them, but this is just a really easy way if you don't use a particular app. Just start tracking how much you're bleeding, when you start bleeding, how many days it goes on for. You can start tracking things like your mood. So you might feel really good around here. Training felt great. You can throw in a muscle emoji. And then maybe you're starting to get tired, because I know for me, that's a symptom that I tend to get. So I'd be putting in that kind of tired emoji. And then maybe you start getting a little bit irritable, or you might have kind of GI distress, and you can put that in as well. So again, it's just a really simple way that from now you can start tracking in your own calendar or in your own diary about how you're kind of feeling and those kind of key information about your cycle. And then what's a normal cycle? As I said, it's highly individual, but there are kind of, I guess, parameters that let us know that we're kind of having a kind of healthy menstrual cycle. And the first one is the length. As I mentioned, 21 to 35 days tends to be what people typically have as their cycle. It may be that little bit longer if you've just started menstruating. And then for your period, you're looking at between 3 to 7 days long, and with the first few days kind of being that heaviest bleeding, then it should taper off and lighten as you go. The amount that you bleed is also important. So again, it's between 40 to 80 milliliters. So that's 18 to 16 regular tampons or pads throughout the whole course of your cycle, or of your period, excuse me. So if you're having more than that, if you're kind of using multiple period products, you're bleeding through a lot, that just might be a sign that you're having heavy bleeding, and it's worth investigating that as well. And then pain's another one. So yes, you will get cramps, and it's quite common to have a little bit of discomfort and cramping in those first few days, but it should go away if you take over-the-counter pain medication. If you require something heavier, that means that you've got dysmenorrhea, which is kind of painful periods, and it's important that, again, you could try and identify what the source of that may be and speak to your healthcare provider. So with this in mind, we're going to move on slightly to kind of menstrual disorders and disturbances as well. So this is where we can start to understand what's going on with our bodies and help advocate for our own health as well. The first one is endometriosis, and 1 in 10 women in Ireland actually have endometriosis, but it can take up to 7 years to diagnose. So it is quite, it's one of those ones that can be hard to diagnose. So the earlier you start tracking and spotting these patterns and symptoms, it allows, well, hopefully should allow you to kind of get that diagnosis earlier as well. But it's where cells that are similar to the uterine lining attach to different parts of our body, normally in the pelvic cavity. And it's incredibly painful. So you're really fatigued. It's kind of defined by really high inflammation, pelvic pain. Going to the bathroom can be really, really painful. And it tends to be worse in and around, when you're due your period as well. So it's really can be quite debilitating. Some people faint from the pain. They're kind of absolutely wiped with fatigue. So again, if this is you, it's not normal. It's really important you go and look at that, because there is support out there and treatment out there for it. And then adenomyosis is something similar, and it's where the uterine lining actually breaks through into the uterine wall. And again, painful cramps, really bad bloating, painful periods. You can kind of go and get this checked out by your doctor if this is something that you're dealing with as well. And then PCOS, you guys might have heard of this before, but it's polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's not actually cysts on your ovaries. What it is those follicles that I talked about, where they start to develop but don't fully develop. So you're kind of left with these little kind of fluid-filled sacs on your ovaries. And typically when you have PCOS, it will be irregular periods, light periods. You'll have excess weight gain, excess facial hair and acne, typically around your face. And then when you get your bloods tested, you'll have higher levels of androgens, which are those male sex hormones, in comparison to the estrogen progesterone. Menstrual disorders then, fibroids. So typically is more common in women who are older, and as well women who are from Afro-Caribbean ethnicities, but it is still common. So 1 in 3 women throughout the course of their lifetime will develop fibroids. They're just like benign growths in the uterus, but they can cause things like heavy bleeding, painful periods, cramps, lower back pain, all that kind of stuff. So it's important that we kind of know what those symptoms are. So maybe if we develop them, we can kind of spot them earlier as well. And then PMS, premenstrual syndrome. So very, very common. Up to like 90% of women and girls will have experienced this at least once in their lifetime. They typically start about kind of 5 to 11 days before your period, and it's anxiety, bloating, fatigue, headaches, breast tenderness. Like there's up to like 300 different symptoms that you can have in and around your that week before you're due your period. So it's important that you track and spot that as well. There's lots that you can do through nutrition as well for that, as well as PCOS, which you can work with the nutritional therapist or nutritionist on that. But PMDD is another one. PMDD is like a very extreme version of PMMS, and it's actually how your brain interacts with progesterone. So it's actually a mood disorder, and it's defined by really extreme mood swings, irritability, depression, might even be suicidal ideation, anger, really bad kind of extreme variants of the bloating and breast tenderness, all of that kind of stuff, and it massively impacts your quality of life. So again, to kind of get diagnosed with this, you'll need to bring your healthcare provider or your therapist. They'll want to see at least 3 cycles of you having these symptoms and them starting and it being a marked difference before you get your period, and then it will leave when it stops. So it's really important, again, that we track our cycles so you can have this information to bring it to your healthcare provider to help get an accurate diagnosis for these things. And then we'll move on to period loss, which is that kind of menstrual dysfunction rather than disorder. So it's called amenorrhea, is the kind of scientific name for it. And it's basically where we don't have a period due to the hormones not rising as they should. Primary amenorrhea is one variant of that, and it's when you don't actually ever start your period. So you might be 16 and you might not have gotten your period, or you might be 14, not have gotten your period, but also not started to develop those secondary sex characteristics we talk about. So the breast developing, hips widening, all that kind of stuff. Secondary amenorrhea then is when you get your period, but then it stops. So typically it's defined as when you've had 3 months or more with no period. There's a couple of different reasons why this might happen, but particularly amongst, I guess, the athletic female population or just women who are more active, it tends to be as a result of hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is kind of a fancy word, basically saying that we don't produce those hormones because of the reasons that I mentioned above. So psychological stress, excessive exercising, disordered eating, or maybe underfueling, whether it's intentional or unintentional, or maybe a combination of these. This used to be called female athlete triad. There's been really great research that's been into that. It's kind of bone mineral density issue, menstrual disturbance, which on one end of the scale is period loss, but could even just be irregular cycles, a shorter luteal phase, you're not producing enough progesterone. And this is actually very common in even recreational athletes. In 2014, this was expanded upon to be called relative energy deficiency in sport. And this is because it also affects men. So they can have the same symptoms and they have low testosterone as a result. And actually it can impact a lot more other aspects of our physical and mental health just beyond those 3 type of criteria. So, another thing is to mention as well is that if you're on the pill for whatever reason, sometimes this can get masked. So when you're on the pill, it shuts down our natural hormone production. So you don't have that extra ability to spot those changes in your menstrual cycle. So you could feel like you're getting your period, but actually it's just that withdrawal bleed from being on those synthetic hormones that you get once a month when you kind of take that break week. And actually you could be at risk of getting osteoporosis and because you're not producing the estrogen or progesterone to support that bone formation as well. So it's just important to note that if you are using hormonal contraception. And this is why learning to fuel ourselves is so, so important. And I know being a teenager, it's quite tough. You get mixed messages out there, but really it's important that we kind of reframe food as a way to fuel ourselves and also nourish ourselves as well. So beyond changes in your menstrual cycle, there are other changes that can help identify or can maybe suggest that you might be suffering from underfueling or that relative energy deficiency in sport. Lack of concentration, changes to your mood. So you're kind of anxious, low energy, fatigue, or irritability. You can also feel cold all the time. Hair and nails get brittle is another one. You can feel really tired in the morning, but then you are actually wide awake at night and you're suffering from insomnia. Risk of illness and injury increases as well, and then you're unable to perform as well as you were able to. So decreases in strength, decrease in endurance performance, and a kind of inability to recover from the training sessions that you are having. So from a daily nutrition point of view, so what we want to get in day to day, first and foremost, and I do this with all my clients, but again, it's really important at the age that you guys are at, is just learn to trust your body. So we get bombarded with all these messages in media being like, leaner is better, only eat 1,300 calories, which actually FYI is what a toddler needs, not what a teenage girl or a woman needs. So, just don't really go down that avenue. But even like, we use apps to track our food and tell us what we need to eat. And we kind of lose our connection with our hunger signals and actually being able to listen and trust our body to tell us what it needs and when we need to eat it. So we kind of go from being either really hungry to really full, and we lose that connection with the more subtle hunger signals that can go on that our body tell us that we're hungry. So it's really, really important. So what I would say is bring it back to basics, which I'll kind of show you in a second now, but also just listen to your hunger cues. So try and start noticing how you feel before and after meals. The only thing I would caveat to this is that for whatever reason, after you exercise, your hunger signals are actually muted. And so even though this is a time that you actually need to get your fuel in, sometimes you might not be hungry. So kind of override it. That's the one time I say override it. And also if you have been restricting your intake for a very long time, our hunger signals actually mute completely. So you might need to kind of override them just to start to kind of get them back working again. But it is really important that, you listen to how your body is telling you that it needs to eat. Fueling yourself. I mentioned this before, just making sure you're eating enough food. So for a teenage girl, whether you're kind of inactive or whether you're very active, anywhere between 1,800 calories to 2,500 calories minimum per day. So again, if you're getting that kind of 20,000 steps in a day, you're more falling above the 2,000 or more calories, and then you're adding on whatever your exercise is. So if you are kind of training a lot, you're playing hockey, then you're playing soccer on the weekend, you're going for hikes with your friends, that's all going to add up. So you need to make sure that you're eating enough and getting those calories through your regular meals and snacks. And on those days that you're training more, you're upping it. So you're looking at kind of 3 meals a day plus a few snacks on those training days before and after, getting in something with your training to fuel that performance. Really, really important. Carbs and fats. Depending on what diet is popular at the time, these tend to get vilified at different stages, but they're really, really important. And we have those 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And it's important that we get a variety of these throughout our diet. And also carbohydrates are our essential fuel source. So regardless of whether you're training or not, eating carbohydrates is important for overall health, for fiber, all of that kind of stuff. But also it's our main fuel source if you are training. So you're going to be leaving something on the table if you're not actually giving yourself that opportunity to go into those sessions fueled. And then fats, really good for like heart health, like those oily nuts, all that kind of stuff, brain health, skin health, but it's also the building blocks of our hormones. So if we're not consuming enough fats, we might not be able to produce our hormones adequately enough. And then protein. Protein is really key for recovery. It's the building blocks of our body, so our bone, our muscles, also our hormones as well, our neurotransmitters, so serotonin, which is our feel-good hormone. So you really want to be aiming to get protein with each meal and ideally with each snack as well. And then if you are training, you want to make sure you're getting about 30 grams of protein, which is like a protein shake or kind of one of those, those 170-gram pots of yogurt, like something like that after your training session. So for example, post-COVID world, when you go back to your kind of pitch training, having that banana and a protein shake in your bag to eat on the way home before you go home for your dinner is going to be really important to kind of help support that recovery. And then you have your main meal kind of within the 2 hours after you do your training. So again, I tend to move people away from calorie counting and weighing food and all that kind of stuff, because that's not, we're kind of how we're designed to eat, and also zero crack and removes all the fun from food. But if you do feel like you need a bit of a guideline, or I guess a toolbox that you can rely on to kind of generally eyeball what constitutes a balanced meal and how to build out those 3 meals throughout the day, use your palm size. So for protein, we're looking at 1 to 2 pounds of protein per meal and 1 pound per snack. If you're training, you up that. For carbohydrates, and now they've got a picture of the fruit, but really we're talking about complex carbohydrates like your rice, your bread, your pasta, your potatoes, all that kind of stuff, your beans. You're looking at 1 to 2 cupped handfuls per meal, and then 1 cup hand for your snack as well. Again, up that if you are training more on certain days. Fats then, use your thumb. So 1 thumb equals about a serving of fats. This could be nuts, seeds, your olive oil that you add to your salads, whatever that might be. And then fruit and veg, I tell people to kind of load up on this. Eat the rainbow. You want to get that nice mix of lots of different stuff throughout your day. So you're getting a good mix of micronutrients and making sure you're kind of helping recovery and optimum health through that as well. So again, these aren't rules. These are just guidelines that you can use to kind of help build out those meals and make sure that you're supporting your recovery and nourishing your body as well. So what might it look like? This is an example. It's not a meal plan in any way, shape, or form. It's an example of how that might look like throughout the day. So getting the scrambled eggs on some toast for your morning, you're having a snack, some fruit with peanut butter, maybe some Amenorrhea milk. That could also be a yogurt with a big granola and some berries on top, whichever you prefer. Having some sort of wrap as well, then with some apple on the side and some tuna or maybe some chicken mixed in with that. You can see here I've got my pre and post training. So I'm making sure I'm feeding myself before my training and I'm having something afterwards. Again, getting that protein hit in afterwards as well is going to be really important to help support my recovery, with some carbohydrates from the berries and the milk as well. And then dinner, sirloin steak, a little bit of steak, and with some sweet potatoes and broccoli, kind of getting that good carbohydrates and also the good mix of carbohydrates and vegetables. And then we've got 2 squares of dark chocolate, or maybe again a bit of yogurt, a bit of ice cream, whatever you want for your dessert after that. So again, it's really all about trying to reframe your food, eating regular meals. Food is something that nourishes you, and just learn to trust your body and understand that it's going to tell you what you need. And if you're too full, then just next time eat less. Stop, you can save the rest. I always leave it for a bit of a snack later on. And if you're still hungry after eating, eat more. That is your body telling you that you are hungry and you need to eat something else. So that's all my information about how to kind of work with your cycle and make sure that you are fueling yourself. I really hope that there was kind of a couple of key takeaways you guys got from that. So firstly is getting to know your cycle. Really just start to understand how to work with your body rather than against it. Don't accept menstrual issues. So kind of empower yourself to advocate for your own health and kind of recognize what they may be. And again, menstrual cycle tracking is a really important part of that as well. And again, fuel and nourish yourself. So make sure that you're supporting your body both through your day-to-day activities, but then also from whatever training or exercise that you are doing on top of that as well. It can seem a little bit overwhelming. There's so much info there and you don't know how to start. Some things might have resonated to you more than others, and for someone else that might be different. So pick the thing that resonated with you the most and then just start to implement that. I take a kind of habit-based approach with all of my clients, which means you pick one thing to work on and implement that over the kind of 2 weeks, and then you go on from that. So it's really about long, sustainable changes, trying to support your health in the long term, and they'll just become part and parcel. Normally, I would say start with tracking. Again, that's normally a good place to start. You can maybe then start looking at how to build out your meals, making sure you've got adequate sort of foods in the cupboard and fridge that are kind of that you like and you enjoy, and they'll help support and nourish your body. And then maybe you're kind of, if you are playing sports, you're making sure you're getting your fuel in before and after sets to help support that. As I said, pick one thing and do it for 2 weeks. If you feel good about it, then pick something else. So start small, build it up slowly, and then go from there. But thanks so much. If you've any questions, let me know. But thanks for coming.
Perfect. So Sinead, that was obviously an incredible presentation. As I was saying, like I learned like so much. Take notes and like everything. I was like, this makes way more sense now. What I suppose what I wanted to know is what inspired you or what was the reason kind of behind you decided to start go with the flow, and I suppose to start doing PT and looking into the menstrual cycle and periods and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so well, my background is actually quite an interesting one where I studied history of art and architecture in college. So my whole plan was to go actually into art management. And then while I was doing my business masters, ended up kind of falling into, I say falling as if it's a bad thing, but kind of ended up going down the route of management consulting. So I worked for a number of years in the corporate world with some tech startups, all this kind of stuff. But I had always wanted, I'd always been really interested in health, and I'd always been really interested in fitness. And actually, recently enough, I came across this list of possible careers that I'd written for myself when I was, I think, in Greece, working a bar for like next to nothing pay, and with my cousin. I think I was my first year of college, and on it I'd written like nutrition coach, yoga instructor, personal trainer, like career counselor, all this kind of stuff. And I found it when my parents were kind of cleaning out the house there recently. I was just like, oh my God, I'm actually doing all this stuff now. I just kind of did it in a slightly roundabout way. But essentially, I'd been really active throughout kind of my teenage years, and then started college and got into that kind of corporate world and just stopped. And I had suffered from an eating disorder while I was a teenager, and that can kind of carry through my earlier years as well. And had kind of always struggled, even though I loved sport and fitness, but it kind of turned into this thing that I had to do, and it was more like a way of punishing myself, and trying to get down to this size and do all this kind of stuff. And there was a lot, I guess, like toxicity there in my approach to my own health and to myself. And I just worked on that, obviously, with a professional, but I also found a gym, which I still work in now, called Fitter, Faster, Stronger Gyms, which just kind of changed my whole approach to how I eat, how I train. I found this kind of community of like-minded people, and the coaches are really, really supportive. And I was just like, I love this. And then I decided to do a personal training course on the side, and was like, oh, just, do it on the side. And if something happens with it. And then once I started learning it again, and, I loved biology when I was in school, I was like, oh my God, this is the best. So then I did an internship again on the side just to kind of test it out. Absolutely adored it. And then I just was like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to do what I love, even though it might be leaving the security of what I've known previously. Because I just want to help people the way I was helped, and kind of teach people, specifically women, about how to support and, I guess, nourish their bodies through exercise and nutrition, rather than trying to beat it up the whole time and be something that we're not supposed to be. Um, so that for me was a huge part of it. And then I kind of started digging more into menstrual cycle health and everything. And again, this just kind of blew me away. I was like, how do we not know about this? Like, how is this not something I was taught in school to track myself? How is this not something that is taught in my personal training course or in these other things that I've come across? And once I started applying it to my own training and myself and my own life, I was like blown away. It like made such a difference to my energy levels. I used to get really frustrated when I couldn't do the same stuff that I would do earlier on in my cycle. And again, I didn't even realize that it was, my cycle that was kind of playing a part. But I'd get really frustrated and try and push through it. And I'd see what all the lads were doing in the gym, and I'm quite competitive. And I'd be like, well, why can't I still do this? And obviously there's something wrong with me now, because I could do this and now I can't do it now. And why am I so tired? And why am I burning out? And like, I get so frustrated. And then once I just started to learn to work with those rhythms, it's just made everything so much better, and like allowed me to be a little bit more self-compassionate with myself and make sure that I am balancing those kind of higher sessions with the lower intensity sessions. And then just went from there. I started applying with my female clients. It worked really well. I started building it out. And then when the kind of lockdown happened, I was like, right, I'm just going to go for it and kind of launch my own, I guess, educational platform and kind of training and nutrition platform to kind of help spread the message in whatever way I can about how to, fuel yourself and feel good, not to look a certain way, and then how to understand your cycle and kind of advocate for yourself from a health perspective, so that you don't have to go through years of your life suffering with endometriosis or period loss, or kind of challenges with how you view your body or food or exercises. And yeah, I just really want to kind of help change people's lives the way I guess my life was changed through something similar.
Yeah, and I mean, why do you think there's like a weird like stigma or lack of desire to educate or whatever it may be basically around like the menstrual cycle? Because like as you said, like it regulates everything that we do, like
Yeah.
food, to our workouts, to our eating, to every single thing. So why are we so reluctant to basically just put it in a closet and walk away?
Yeah, it's a very complicated one. Where I think, obviously part of it goes back to the whole kind of patriarchal society and all that kind of stuff, and it not really being a priority to understand how we might work in sync with the rhythms of a menstrual cycle. And also there's been this weird taboo for years, and again that's kind of mentioned in the presentation about kind of that it was dirty or something that shouldn't really be talked about or anything like that, which is 100% not the case. So things like sanitary products in comparison to just calling them what they are, which is period products or menstrual products. So I think that's definitely played a big role when I was growing up. Like it was something to be ashamed of or like embarrassed, even though actually it's something to be celebrated. You're like, I'm healthy, I'm menstruating, and whatever, it happens to me here and here. And in fairness, I even remember with my brother growing up, he'd be kind of like, oh, this is that. And I was like, no, you need to know this because you're going to have friends who are girls. If you're straight, you might have a girlfriend. Like, you need to understand how this works. And I'm the exact same kind of with my partner at the time. I'm like, it's just part and parcel. Like, so much of the population is kind of menstruates, like whether they identify as a woman or not, they menstruate. So we need to understand what's going on in our bodies. And then I just think it's lack of education. So it just isn't something that has ever been researched really or discussed. So that information or education piece hasn't been there for, say, coaches or fitness professionals or kind of educational professionals, which now thankfully is massively starting to change through, say, the work of like Orico and Fitter Woman or Dr. Stacey Sims, or like even the likes of myself, who, I work with a lot of teams to try and help educate both the players, but then also the coaches. And I do a session with the coaches specifically to try and help normalize that conversation. And again, there's been a whole lot of research into things like the red S and how to kind of screen for that, bring that up in kind of training teams, because really it should just be something else. Like, if an athlete or someone or a kind of client isn't recovering properly, you're like, okay, how are you sleeping? How are you eating? So why aren't you how, what's your menstrual cycle like? I work with all of my clients in sync with their menstrual cycle. So I'm very comfortable having that conversation there where I'm like, hey, so what phase are you in? And they're like, oh, I'm PMS, I'm feeling really bad. Or they'll text me the day before being like, I'm really, I've got really bad PMS symptoms this time. Can we just take it gentler? And I just adjust their training session based on that. But it's about just trying to start and everyone educating themselves about how this works. So parents, teachers, coaches, people in the health care profession, and then individuals, so that they can kind of normalize the conversation, and then just trying to go for it. And like, I'm still a little bit, even with my kind of colleagues who are guys, I'm like, yeah, I'm just taking it low key today because I'm phase 4, and it's still even not uncomfortable, but it's still new for me to say to people who aren't in my kind of immediate circle. But it really is, the more we do it and the more people who do it, the more normal that conversation can become. And it's just going to be, hopefully, a regular part of the conversation about overall health and performance. That's my vision anyway, as I'm sure it is for everyone else.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And even like as you were saying, like I've three older brothers and like my dad, and obviously like I have no limbs. So like if it comes and one of them are looking after me, like we just
Yeah.
roll with it. Like we're just kind of hoping for the best. But I think you're right, like because even I've kind of noticed like the conversations, even though obviously as you said yourself, like it is segregated to women, but I think at the minute it
Hmm.
should be like a woman's conversation, and then afterwards like the boys should be brought in and be like, well, this is what happened.
Absolutely.
Like I think at the end of the day, like it affects them as well. Like if a woman doesn't know her cycle, you don't know when you could get someone like pregnant or like anything.
100%. 100%. And actually, at the minute, I'm doing a fertility education course, and one whole talk, and I'm even of the opinion that the whole thing should be really, the guys should be involved. But one whole part is, if having that partner, especially the partner's male, into that conversation, so that they can understand and support their partner through that journey. And yeah, it's just, we don't think about it until all of a sudden you're trying to conceive, and then you're like, oh, I have no idea if I even ovulate or what's going on. So, or even just like the choices around contraception and why you may or may not want to be on them and different things like that. Like, a huge part that we just don't know. Or again, for me, the energy. Like, I used to be absolutely wiped around around kind of PMS in the first few days of my cycle, and like, I can totally manage that now. And I know I even manage like meetings and stuff like that. Or like, I notice that when I do my classes, like I do a movement mobility class where I guide people through it. and like I'm more out of breath. I find it harder. I forget my words. I say left and right the wrong way. I actually did a talk when I was, 2 days before my period. It's not that you can't, but I should have known that actually, because I get a bit more control over my calendar, that maybe that wasn't a great time for me to do it. But I did it anyway, and I really struggled to get my words out. So either you can help adjust your kind of calendar to suit your kind of schedule, I guess, as best possible, but that's not always feasible. But you can prepare for it. You can make sure that you're doing those things, like you're sleeping, you're asking people for help, you're eating the foods that are going to help bring down inflammation or maybe get those extra micronutrients into your cycle, and you're like adjusting your training and giving yourself that grace and a bit of self-compassion to be like, it's okay for me to rest, and it's not weak, and it's not that I'm something wrong with me. It's that I'm just listening to what my cycle is telling me right now, and I'm going with that. So yeah,
Yeah.
huge amount of benefits. And then you can get your partner to support you again if your partner is kind of male to help you do that. So it's something that is very much a normal part of the conversation in my household now. And I'll just be like, look, I'm not gonna be feeling great for the next few days. So if the kitchen's messy, that's what's gonna happen. And we're just gonna ignore it. Or could you help me out with X, Y, and Z because this is gonna happen? Or again, he cooks, he does most cooking in the house. So it'd be like, can we make sure we're getting in maybe more of those like oily fish to kind of bring down inflammation and different sort of stuff like that. So yeah, it's really just trying to normalize the conversation, and hopefully one day we'll kind of get to that point where it's just part and parcel of everyday chat.
I have like the absent like mind, so like I would just like sit and ignore something for like 6 hours like straight, and that's very like odd for me because I like talking to people, so like it doesn't bother me.
Mm,
But sometimes like we just be like sitting on the couch, like being like friends and whoever, and it's just like, Joanne, you haven't said anything for like the last like hour, and I'm
yeah,
like, I haven't even noticed you're here. I've
yeah.
just been in a world of my own.
I know, but it's funny because again, when once you start tracking, and like it's going to be very different for different people, but like that stuff happens where like I'll forget my words, or you kind of don't talk, or like I'll get super like loud noises if things are really loud with TV and stuff. I'm like, oh, would you turn it down? And it normally happens in and around that time. I don't know why, but it's just something that I'm aware of, so that I'm like, okay, this is why this is happening. So it removes the frustration around it, or it helps me kind of understand me and why I feel that way at that particular time, where I might be more irritable or sensitive to things like lights, sounds, whatever might be going on, that I just kind of want to go to the bedroom and read my book rather than going out and, well, not that we can really socialize now, but in the
Yeah.
past, go for a big social event. So it's a great kind of way to tune in with ourselves and support ourselves that little bit better.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of throughout your talk like a couple of books, that I suppose would have
Mm,
influenced you and kind of inspired you. And I suppose at the minute, like a lot of the information that we have to get is either through like unchecked like online resources,
yeah, yeah.
not peer reviewed kind of journals and things like that. That's a
Mm.
big, like college term. I feel like for the 14, 16-year-olds, we're not gonna have peer reviewed journals. That's a very college.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think what I'm trying to say is, it's like advice that kind of goes like unchecked. So like what
Mm, mm,
kind of books or resources would you kind of recommend? I know we said Fitter Women and Oracle, but
yeah.
if girls kind of want to pick up a book or they just want to kind of not have like a nose on Google, but like who would you kind of be recommending
Yeah.
go to?
Someone big fan of is Maisie Hill. She is the author of Period Power, and it's just a fantastic book insofar as it kind of covers a lot of different facets of it. So it goes through, I guess those seasons of your cycle, that more kind of intuitive approach to understanding your cycle, but also dives into kind of health and kind of how to make sure that you're checking these things. And she goes through the political and social aspects of kind of menstrual cycle health and kind of awareness within the community as well. So it's fantastic. She's got a lovely way of writing as well. So really recommend that as just kind of a go-to, covers a lot of boxes. Another one for, I guess, someone who may be more active is the Roar book by Dr. Stacey Sims. A little bit out of date now, like she's got an online course which is very good, that is more up to date, but again, some good references in that and kind of good recommendations. I also love the book No Period Now What, which the audience it's for an older audience. It's more for people who are super active and have lost their cycles and are now trying to conceive. But again, if maybe like a parent, or even if you're kind of interested in reading yourself, very well researched, and she has fantastic blog posts on her blog account where she goes through the different information. So highly recommend that as well. And then there's a book that came out. Sorry, I've got two more. I've got like a massive list, but two more that have come out. One is called Just Eat It, by Dr. Laura Thomas, and that is all about intuitive eating. So fantastic for anyone who may feel like they need that extra support, or kind of feel like they've kind of fallen into the trap of that diet culture and struggle with their relationship with food and eating. It's a really, really good first step. Obviously, if anyone is really suffering and there's a lot of kind of distress and anxiety around that, I would recommend you go and speak to a healthcare professional or a therapist about that. But as a kind of way to just address our relationship with food and our body image, it's a fantastic resource. And then I think it's called the Girl Power Guide to, I'll get it again, but it's by a psychologist. I think she's based in Dublin, and she wrote basically like a manual, Girl Power Guide to, oh, the name's gone out of my head. I can see the cover, but it's fantastic. I'll find it and I'll send it on to you so you can maybe add it to the reference notes for it. But again, it's directed at teenage girls to help them guide through kind of mental health, menstrual health, like how to look after yourself. It's just a great resource. So they're kind of my go-to recommendations, and you can like pick out which ones might suit you best.
Yeah, and finally, our last question for Shine, which is if Sinead was standing in front of 14-year-old Sinead, what would she say to her?
Yeah, lots. um, yeah, for me, as I kind of mentioned before, like I would have suffered with an eating disorder and kind of body dysmorphia and all that kind of stuff. And that was starting around that age. And it kind of peaked when I was about 16, 17, but kind of continued for a lot of years. So really like give me a big old hug and being like, you don't need to look a certain way or eat a certain way to be loved or accepted or fit the mold of what people think you should be. So that's really a big one, is just, yeah, again, just trying to change the way I viewed exercise and food and more focus on why I enjoyed it and why it was good for me. That would be the first one. The other one is tracking my cycle. Like I'm just like, how did I not do this? And again, I kind of went on hormonal contraceptive just because I had issues with my skin and stuff like that. And that was kind of was just what was done. So I, wish I'd kind of learned to understand why maybe I was feeling certain ways throughout my period and through my cycle. Um, and I guess connected in a little bit more with myself. And then the final one is just like, just go do what you love. Like, sorry, got huge benefit out of going down the path that I did and learned lots from the different kind of jobs that I've had. But I always kind of knew that I wanted to work in this area and I just didn't back myself in it. And so yeah, just try it. Like go on those adventures, do the things that you enjoy, move because it feels good, dance because you feel it feels good. You don't have to go lift weights in the gym if you don't like that. If you love it, like me, by all means, go ahead and do the kind of CrossFit S&C stuff. But yeah, just back yourself, do what you love, and then just try and think about long-term sustainable health rather than short-term fixes. Just ditch that old diet culture. So yeah, they're the kind of three things that I would say.